Have you ever opened your bank account and discovered that someone had taken a piece of your life without asking? That was the question I found myself asking on a quiet Tuesday morning when $35,000 disappeared from my savings account. My name is Abigail Carter. I am 69 years old, retired, and until that day, I believed the most difficult chapter of my life had already passed. My parents were gone. My husband had passed away 7 years earlier. I had spent years rebuilding a peaceful life in a small Ohio town where most days followed a comfortable routine. I woke early, watered the flowers on my porch, drank coffee while watching the neighborhood come alive, and tried not to think too much about the family tensions that had followed me for decades. That morning started no differently. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and my tablet, reviewing my monthly statements the way I always did. My father used to say that small problems become large ones when people stop paying attention. I suppose that habit stayed with me. At first, I thought I had opened the wrong account. The balance on the screen was lower than it should have been. Much lower. I blinked and refreshed the page. The numbers stayed exactly the same. Then I saw the withdrawal. $35,000. Processed 3 days earlier. My stomach tightened. I checked the transaction details again. Then again. The withdrawal was listed as completed. Authorized. Final. For several seconds, I simply stared at the screen. The amount represented years of careful saving. Emergency funds. Security. Peace of mind. I knew with absolute certainty that I had not authorized that transaction. My hands trembled slightly as I called the bank. After several minutes of verification, the representative reviewed the account. Her tone remained professional and polite. According to our records, ma'am, the withdrawal was completed in person at one of our branch locations. In person, the words echoed in my mind. That is impossible, I replied. I was not at the bank. She apologized and suggested I schedule an appointment with the branch manager. After ending the call, I sat quietly in my kitchen. Outside, a delivery truck moved down the street. A neighbor walked her dog. Ordinary life continued while my thoughts raced in every direction. By noon, I called my older brother Thomas. If there was one person who always seemed to know everything happening in the family, it was him. Thomas had spent his entire life as what people now call the golden child. Teachers loved him. Our parents adored him. Relatives praised him. Even as adults, people seemed to trust him instinctively. When he answered, I explained what happened. There was a brief pause before he responded. The bank probably made a mistake, he said. Those systems mess things up all the time. His answer sounded reasonable, yet something about it felt rehearsed. Too quick, too confident. I asked whether he had ever heard of anything similar happening. Abby, trust me, he said with a soft laugh. You are worrying yourself over nothing. Trust me. Thomas had been saying those words for as long as I could remember. Most of my life, everyone else did. For some reason, this time felt different. After we hung up, I logged back into my account and reviewed the transaction details one more time. That was when I noticed something that made my heart skip. The withdrawal authorization included a signed document, a document I had never seen before, and according to the bank records, it carried my signature. The next morning, I drove to the bank carrying a folder filled with account statements and questions I could not stop asking myself. The branch sat on the edge of town beside a grocery store and a pharmacy I had visited countless times over the years. Everything looked ordinary. The parking lot, the glass doors, the flower beds near the entrance. Yet as I walked inside, nothing felt ordinary anymore. A young employee directed me to a private office where the branch manager introduced herself as Denise Morgan. She was professional without being cold, and within minutes I found myself explaining the entire situation. Denise listened carefully. She did not interrupt. She did not dismiss my concerns. When I finished, she opened several files on her computer and reviewed the transaction. The silence stretched for nearly a minute. Finally, she turned the screen slightly toward me. The withdrawal was completed here at this branch 3 days ago, she said. According to our records, identification was presented and paperwork was signed. My stomach tightened. May I see the paperwork? Denise nodded. A few moments later, a scanned copy appeared on the screen. There it was. My name, my account number, my signature. At least, that was what the document claimed. I leaned forward and stared at it. For anyone else, it probably looked authentic. The letters flowed in the same general style. The shape seemed convincing. Yet something immediately felt wrong. I signed my name nearly every week. birthday cards, checks, tax forms, medical documents. I knew my own handwriting the way people know their own reflection. This signature looked like someone had studied it rather than written it naturally. The capital A was slightly wider than mine. The final stroke curved in the wrong direction. Tiny details, perhaps, but enough. That is not my signature, I said quietly. Denise studied the document again. You are certain? I nodded without hesitation. Completely. She printed a copy and handed it to me. As I held the paper, memories surfaced unexpectedly. Growing up, Thomas always seemed to have a gift for becoming whatever people expected him to be. Teachers trusted him. Neighbors praised him. Even when he made mistakes, someone always found an explanation. Our parents called him responsible long before he actually was. I was the cautious one, the practical one. Yet somehow Thomas always received the benefit of the doubt. Looking at the document, I remembered something else. Years ago, during the process of settling our mother's estate, Thomas had handled most of the paperwork. More than once, he joked that he knew my signature almost as well as I did because he had seen it on so many family documents. At the time, the comment meant nothing. Now it echoed differently. Denise asked whether anyone else might have had access to my information. I considered the question carefully. Very few people knew the details of my accounts. Even fewer would have any reason to use them. I thought about Thomas again. Then I immediately felt guilty for thinking it. He was my brother. We had known each other for more than 60 years. Yet the uneasy feeling remained. Before I left, Denise gave me copies of everything related to the transaction and explained the next steps in the review process. As I walked back to my car, I glanced down at the signature one more time. The more I looked at it, the less convincing it became. Whoever created it had gotten close. Close enough to fool the bank. Close enough to move $35,000. But not close enough to fool me. And for the first time since this began, I stopped asking whether something was wrong. Instead, I began asking who wanted me to believe nothing was wrong at all. That evening, I sat at my dining room table with the copied signature placed beside a stack of old documents from my filing cabinet. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking clock above the kitchen doorway. One by one, I compared signatures from different years. Tax returns, insurance forms, property records, greeting cards. I was not a handwriting expert, but I did not need to be. The differences became more obvious with every comparison. Whoever signed that withdrawal document understood what my signature looked like. They simply did not understand how I actually wrote it. There is a difference. Genuine signatures develop naturally over time. They carry habits people do not think about. Mine always slanted slightly upward. The signature on the bank document remained perfectly level. Mine ended with a sharp finishing stroke. The other ended with a hesitant curve. Small details, yet impossible for me to ignore. Around 8 o'clock, my telephone rang. The caller identification displayed Thomas's number. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail. Instead, I answered. His voice sounded relaxed, friendly, familiar. He asked about my day and whether I had learned anything from the bank. I told him I had reviewed the paperwork. A brief silence followed. Then he laughed softly. See? Probably just some misunderstanding. The comment bothered me more than it should have. He had not asked what the paperwork showed. He had not asked whether the bank found anything unusual. He simply assumed the situation would disappear. The signature is not mine, I said. Another pause. Slightly longer this time. Abby, you are overthinking this. There it was again. The same phrase. The same tone. The same gentle dismissal I had heard my entire life whenever my concerns became inconvenient. After we ended the call, I remained seated at the table staring at the documents. Memories surfaced one after another. Family holidays, birthday parties, graduation ceremonies. Every major event seemed to follow the same pattern. Thomas succeeded. People celebrated. Thomas made mistakes. People explained them away. Even after our parents passed, the pattern continued. Relatives still treated him as the dependable one, the trustworthy one. Looking back, I wondered how much of that reputation came from reality and how much came from repetition. The next morning, I received an email from Denise Morgan. The bank had officially opened a fraud review. She requested additional information regarding my whereabouts on the day of the withdrawal. Fortunately, that answer was simple. On the date listed in the transaction records, I had spent the entire afternoon at a community volunteer event nearly 30 miles away. There were photographs, attendance records, dozens of witnesses. I gathered everything and sent it to Denise. As I organized the information, another detail caught my attention. The withdrawal occurred less than 48 hours after a family gathering at my cousin's house. Thomas had attended. During the event, he spent an unusual amount of time asking questions about finances. At the time, I assumed he was making conversation. Now those questions felt different. I remembered him asking whether I still used the same bank, whether I preferred online banking or branch visits, whether I planned to make any major financial changes after retirement. Harmless questions on the surface, yet suddenly they seemed connected. By late afternoon, doubt had evolved into suspicion. Not certainty, not yet, but enough suspicion to make me uncomfortable. The most troubling part was not the missing money. It was realizing that the person I increasingly suspected was the same person everyone else trusted without question. And if I was right, proving the truth would require more than instincts. It would require evidence strong enough to overcome a lifetime of excuses. Over the next several days, the situation spread through the family faster than I expected. I had not called anyone to discuss my suspicions, yet somehow relatives began hearing fragments of the story. The first call came from my cousin Patricia. Her voice carried the careful tone people use when they believe they are helping. She told me I should not jump to conclusions. She reminded me that banks make mistakes. She reminded me that Thomas had always looked after family matters. I listened politely, but when the conversation ended, I found myself staring out the kitchen window wondering how she had learned about the situation at all. I certainly had not told her. 2 days later, another relative called. Then another. Each conversation followed the same pattern. Nobody directly accused me of being wrong, yet everyone seemed eager to defend Thomas before any facts had even been established. The experience felt strangely familiar. It brought me back to childhood dinners where Thomas received praise for accomplishments, while my concerns were treated as overreactions. Decades had passed, but some family habits never seemed to disappear. On Friday afternoon, I attended a small gathering at my niece's home. Normally, I enjoyed these events. This time felt different. Conversations quieted slightly when I entered certain rooms. People exchanged quick glances they probably thought I would not notice. During dessert, Thomas arrived with his wife Linda. He greeted everyone warmly and moved through the house like a man completely at ease. Watching him, I almost questioned myself again. He looked exactly like the brother everyone trusted. Calm, confident, friendly. Then our eyes met across the room. For a brief moment, his smile faltered. Not enough for anyone else to notice. Enough for me. Later, while people gathered in the backyard, Linda approached me carrying 2 glasses of iced tea. She handed one to me and sat beside me on the patio. At first, the conversation remained pleasant. Then she gently shifted toward the subject everyone seemed determined to discuss. Thomas told me you are still worried about the bank issue, she said. I nodded. I am waiting for answers. Linda offered a sympathetic smile. Sometimes stress makes things seem larger than they really are. The comment sounded harmless. Yet something about it irritated me. Not because it was rude, because it assumed the problem existed only in my imagination. I asked whether Thomas had mentioned seeing the transaction documents. She shook her head quickly. Too quickly. Then she changed the subject. The exchange lasted less than 5 minutes, but it left me with an uncomfortable feeling. By the time I returned home that evening, I realized something important. Nobody seemed interested in finding out what actually happened. They were interested in protecting the version of events that made Thomas look innocent. The following Monday, Denise Morgan called with an update. The fraud review remained active, but she had discovered several inconsistencies that required additional examination. Her tone remained careful, yet I sensed she was taking the situation increasingly seriously. Before ending the call, she asked a question that caught me off guard. Mrs. Carter, has anyone in your family expressed unusual interest in the investigation? I hesitated. Then I thought about the phone calls, the conversations, the pressure to stop asking questions. Why do you ask? I replied. Denise paused briefly before answering. Because sometimes the strongest clues are not found in documents. Sometimes they appear in the behavior of people who are worried about what those documents might reveal. The day after Denise's phone call, I returned to the bank for what I assumed would be another routine update. By then, nearly 2 weeks had passed since I first discovered the missing money, and I had learned an important lesson. Every answer seemed to create 2 new questions. Denise greeted me in the same private office where we had met before. This time, however, something felt different. A folder rested on her desk, and unlike our previous meetings, she appeared unusually focused. After we exchanged a few pleasantries, she opened the folder and reviewed several pages. "Mrs. Carter," she said carefully, "we are still examining the signature issue, but another detail has become increasingly important." I sat forward slightly. "What detail?" Denise turned one of the documents toward me. It contained information related to the transaction itself. Dates, times, verification procedures, employee notes. Nothing immediately stood out. Then she pointed to a line near the bottom of the page. "The withdrawal was completed inside the branch during normal business hours." I nodded. "I know that part." Denise paused. "What most people forget is that banks document more than paperwork." For a moment, I did not understand what she meant. Then realization began to form. "You mean security records?" I asked. Denise gave a small nod. "Possibly." My pulse quickened. Until that moment, I had been focused entirely on signatures, documents, and account records. The idea that another form of evidence might exist had barely crossed my mind. Denise explained that many branch activities were routinely recorded for security purposes. Access to those materials followed strict procedures, but because an official fraud review was underway, additional resources could be examined if necessary. She spoke carefully, never promising anything. Yet her words carried weight. For the first time, I sensed the investigation moving beyond assumptions and into facts that could not be argued away. On my drive home, I thought about Thomas. More specifically, I thought about his confidence. From the very beginning, he had acted as though the situation would disappear if I simply stopped asking questions. He never seemed worried about the documents. He never seemed curious about the investigation. Looking back, his calmness now felt strange, almost calculated. That evening, he called again. The timing alone felt suspicious. We exchanged a few routine comments before he brought up the bank. "Any progress?" he asked casually. "A little," I replied. "They are reviewing more information." The silence that followed lasted longer than usual. Then he laughed softly. "Well, I am sure they will figure out it was just some misunderstanding." There was that word again. Misunderstanding. By now, I had heard it so many times that it no longer sounded reassuring. It sounded strategic. I changed the subject and ended the conversation shortly afterward. The next morning, another email arrived from Denise. She requested that I stop by later that week. The message itself was brief, but one sentence immediately caught my attention. "We may have identified additional evidence relevant to the transaction." I read the line 3 times. Additional evidence. Not speculation. Not theory. Evidence. For the rest of the day, I found it impossible to concentrate on anything else. Every possibility ran through my mind. What had they found? Another document? Another witness? A procedural error? Whatever it was, Denise's tone suggested something significant had changed. As evening settled over the neighborhood, I sat on my porch watching the sun disappear behind the trees. For weeks, I had felt like I was chasing shadows. Now it seemed the shadows were beginning to take shape. Somewhere inside that bank existed a piece of information powerful enough to change the entire story. And for the first time since the money vanished, I started to believe that the truth might be much closer than anyone expected. 2 days later, I returned to the bank with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Denise met me in the lobby and immediately led me back to the private office. The moment I sat down, I sensed that something important had happened. She closed the door, took her seat across from me, and opened the same folder I had seen during our previous meeting. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then she folded her hands and looked directly at me. "Mrs. Carter, we have completed additional verification regarding the transaction." My heart began to race. "And?" I asked. Denise slid a document across the desk. "First, we confirmed your timeline." I looked down at the paper. It contained information from the community volunteer event I attended on the day of the withdrawal. Sign-in records, witness confirmations, timestamps from photographs. Everything placed me nearly 30 miles away from the bank when the transaction occurred. "There is no possibility you were physically present here that afternoon," Denise said. Relief mixed with anxiety. One question had been answered, but a larger one remained. If I was not there, who was? Denise continued reviewing notes. "We also interviewed employees who were working that day." I listened carefully. One teller vaguely remembered assisting an older customer. Another remembered the transaction because of the unusually large withdrawal amount. Yet neither employee could confidently identify the individual involved. Time had passed. Memories faded. Nothing from their statements provided certainty. For a moment, disappointment settled over me. Then Denise turned to another page. However, she said, there is something else. The room seemed to grow quieter. She explained that the bank had begun reviewing security records associated with the transaction window. Accessing those records required authorization and additional procedures, which was why the process had taken time. I nodded, trying to remain calm. Inside, my thoughts were moving a mile a minute. Were you able to find anything? I asked. Denise hesitated just long enough to make my pulse quicken. We located footage from that day. I stared at her. Footage? She nodded. The review is still ongoing, but we confirmed that recordings exist for the period surrounding the transaction. For several seconds, I could not speak. The possibility felt almost unreal. For weeks, everything had depended on conflicting stories, assumptions, and paperwork. Suddenly, there was a chance that an impartial witness existed. A witness that never forgot details and never changed its story. Denise remained careful with her wording. She did not tell me what the footage showed. She explained that internal procedures required additional review before conclusions could be shared. Still, her tone revealed something important. She no longer sounded uncertain. She sounded focused. As our meeting ended, I gathered my papers and walked toward the parking lot. The autumn air felt cooler than usual. Across the street, people moved through their ordinary routines without realizing how dramatically my own life had changed over the past few weeks. On the drive home, I thought about Thomas again. More specifically, I thought about his reaction whenever new information emerged. Every update seemed to make him eager for the investigation to end. Every conversation seemed designed to encourage me to stop asking questions. That evening, he called once more. His timing was becoming almost predictable. After a few minutes of small talk, he asked whether the bank had reached any conclusions. Not yet, I replied. They are reviewing additional evidence. Silence followed, longer than before. Then he cleared his throat and changed the subject. It was a small moment, but it stayed with me long after the call ended. Later that night, I sat alone in my living room looking at the stack of documents spread across my coffee table. The signature, the withdrawal records, the witness statements, the timeline. Every piece pointed in the same direction. And now there was something even stronger waiting just beyond reach. Somewhere inside the bank's security system existed a record of exactly what happened that afternoon. For the first time since the money disappeared, I felt certain that the truth was no longer hiding. It was simply waiting to be seen. 3 days later, Denise called and asked whether I could come to the bank that afternoon. Her voice remained professional, but there was something different beneath it. The uncertainty that had characterized our earlier conversations was gone. In its place was quiet confidence. The moment I hung up, I knew the investigation had reached a turning point. The drive to the branch felt longer than usual. Every red light seemed to last forever. Every mile gave my imagination another opportunity to race ahead. By the time I arrived, my hands were trembling slightly. Denise met me near the entrance and escorted me directly to the private office. After closing the door, she sat across from me and opened a folder thicker than any I had seen before. For a few moments, she reviewed several documents without speaking. Then she looked up. Mrs. Carter, the security review has been completed. My heart pounded so loudly I could barely hear myself think. What did you find? Denise took a slow breath. The footage confirms that the individual who completed the transaction was not you. Even though I already knew I had not been there, hearing the words spoken aloud felt strangely emotional. Weeks of doubt seemed to lift from my shoulders at once. Are you absolutely certain? I asked. Denise nodded. Yes. She turned a document toward me. The timestamps matched the withdrawal records exactly. I stared at the paper. My mind immediately jumped to the next question. If it was not me, then who was it? Denise remained silent for a moment. Then she continued. The individual was clearly visible during multiple portions of the visit. I felt my stomach tighten. Every instinct I had fought against for weeks suddenly returned. Images of family gatherings, conversations, and old memories flashed through my mind. Denise opened another page inside the folder. Because this is part of an active investigation, there are limits on what I can share directly today, she explained. However, I can tell you that the footage supports the concerns you raised regarding unauthorized activity." Her careful wording told me more than she probably realized. She was not dismissing my suspicions anymore. She was validating them. As we continued talking, Denise described the sequence of events recorded that afternoon. The individual entered the branch, approached the service desk, presented documentation, completed paperwork, remained inside long enough for multiple cameras to capture clear images. Nothing about the visit appeared rushed or accidental. Whoever conducted the transaction believed they would never be questioned. That realization unsettled me more than the missing money itself. Confidence like that usually comes from familiarity. Familiarity with procedures. Familiarity with information. Familiarity with the victim. When our meeting ended, Denise informed me that the matter would continue through the bank's formal process. Additional parties would be contacted. Records would be preserved. The evidence would remain available if needed. I thanked her and gathered my papers. As I stood to leave, she said something that stopped me. "Mrs. Carter, sometimes people spend years protecting a version of someone that does not actually exist." I looked at her for several seconds before nodding. On the drive home, I thought about Thomas constantly. Not because I wanted to believe he was responsible. Quite the opposite. Part of me desperately wanted another explanation to appear. Yet every new fact seemed to eliminate another possibility. That evening, my telephone rang again. Thomas. For the first time since this began, I let it ring without answering. I watched his name disappear from the screen and felt an unexpected sense of calm. The investigation no longer depended on what anyone claimed happened. It no longer depended on family loyalty, reputation, or old assumptions. Somewhere inside the bank's records existed a witness that never forgot details and never changed its story. And that witness had finally spoken. 4 days later, I invited several family members to my house for what I described as a simple family discussion. I chose my words carefully. If I had called it a confrontation, half of them would have found excuses not to attend. By Saturday afternoon, my dining room was filled with familiar faces. Patricia arrived first. 2 cousins followed. Linda came with Thomas. Everyone appeared curious. Some looked nervous. Others seemed mildly annoyed to be there. Thomas, however, entered with the same calm confidence he had carried throughout the entire situation. He greeted everyone warmly and even joked about how serious my invitation had sounded. Watching him, I understood why people trusted him so easily. He knew exactly how to make others feel comfortable. We spent the first 20 minutes discussing ordinary things. The weather, retirement, family updates. Eventually, I stood and walked toward the television mounted on the wall. The room gradually grew quiet. "Thank you all for coming," I said. I wanted everyone to hear the same information at the same time. Several people exchanged puzzled looks. Thomas leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. "Abby," he said with a smile, "you are making this sound dramatic." I looked at him for a moment before turning toward the television. Beside it sat a folder containing copies of the bank records, transaction documents, witness statements, and correspondence from the investigation. For weeks, I had carried those papers everywhere. Now I finally understood that the documents alone were no longer the most important evidence. Many of you know that money was withdrawn from my account without my authorization. I began. Some of you encouraged me to let it go. Some of you believed it was simply a misunderstanding. No one interrupted. The room remained silent. I continued. The bank completed its review. At that moment, Thomas shifted slightly in his chair. It was a small movement, but I noticed it immediately. They confirmed that I was not present when the transaction occurred. Patricia looked surprised. One cousin glanced toward Thomas. Linda stared down at the table. I opened the folder and placed several documents in front of the group. Then I explained the timeline. The volunteer event, the witness confirmations, the investigation, the signature analysis. Every piece of information pointed in the same direction. Still, nobody spoke. They were waiting for the final answer. Finally, I took a slow breath. The security footage confirmed who completed the transaction. The words seemed to settle over the room like a heavy blanket. For the first time all afternoon, Thomas stopped smiling. His expression remained controlled, but the confidence was gone. "Abby," he said quietly, "you do not need to do this." The sentence hit me harder than I expected, not because of what it meant, but because of what it revealed. He already knew. Before I could respond, Patricia looked back and forth between us. "Thomas," she said, "what is she talking about?" He opened his mouth, but did not answer immediately. The silence stretched. Suddenly, every excuse that had protected him for decades seemed to disappear at once. No clever explanation arrived. No reassuring smile fixed the problem. No one rushed to defend him. They were all waiting, just like I was. Finally, Thomas lowered his eyes. That single gesture told the room more than any speech could have. Around me, relatives sat frozen in disbelief. Not because they had seen the evidence themselves, because for the first time in their lives, they were confronting a possibility they had never allowed themselves to consider. The golden child they spent decades protecting might not have been who they believed he was. And sitting there at the head of my dining table, surrounded by documents and silence, I realized the investigation was finally over. The truth no longer belonged only to me. Now everyone could see it. After the family gathering ended, people lingered in small groups throughout the house. Conversations that once flowed easily now felt cautious and uncertain. No one seemed quite sure what to say. For decades, Thomas had occupied a special place within the family. He was the dependable son, the successful brother, the person everyone believed could do no wrong. Watching that image crack was uncomfortable for all of them. Yet the truth had a way of demanding space once it entered a room. Over the following weeks, the situation moved through the proper channels. The bank completed its investigation. The records were reviewed. The documentation was preserved. Piece by piece, the facts established what had happened. The missing funds were recovered through the bank's procedures and related corrective actions. When I received confirmation that the money had been restored, I expected to feel triumphant. Instead, I felt surprisingly calm. The money mattered, of course. $35,000 represented years of careful planning and financial security. But somewhere along the way, the investigation had become about something larger. It had become about reality. About refusing to doubt my own judgment simply because other people found the truth inconvenient. Thomas called several times during those weeks. At first, I did not answer. Eventually, I agreed to meet him for coffee at a small cafe near the edge of town. The conversation was not dramatic. There were no raised voices, no emotional speeches. In many ways, that made it more difficult. For the first time in my life, my brother seemed genuinely uncertain of himself. He looked older than I remembered, tired. We talked for nearly an hour. Some questions received answers. Others did not. Certain wounds heal slowly, and some never disappear completely. When we parted that afternoon, I understood something important. Forgiveness and trust are not the same thing. One can exist without the other. Back at home, life gradually settled into a new routine. The investigation ended. The phone call stopped. Family gatherings became less tense. Yet something fundamental had changed inside me. Growing up, I spent years competing against an impossible standard. No matter what I achieved, Thomas always seemed to receive more praise. No matter how carefully I handled responsibilities, people assumed he was the reliable one. For most of my life, I quietly accepted that role. I told myself it did not matter. Deep down, perhaps it always had. One crisp autumn morning, I found myself standing beside my parents' graves. The cemetery sat beneath a canopy of colorful leaves, and the air carried the familiar scent of approaching winter. I stood there for several minutes, thinking about family, expectations, and the strange ways people create stories about one another. My parents loved both of their children. I believe that. Yet love does not always prevent mistakes. Sometimes people see what they want to see. Sometimes they protect an image for so long that they stop noticing reality. Looking across the peaceful grounds, I realized I no longer needed anyone's approval. Not my parents, not my relatives, not even Thomas's. The investigation had given me something far more valuable than recovered money. It had given me confidence in myself, confidence in my instincts, confidence in my ability to recognize the truth even when everyone around me preferred a simpler story. As I turned and walked back toward my car, sunlight filtered through the trees and illuminated the path ahead. For the first time in many years, I felt completely at peace. The missing money had been returned. The facts had been established. The illusion had finally ended. And perhaps the greatest victory of all was that I no longer felt the need to compete with the golden child. I was finally free to simply be myself.